Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the former Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale, and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Welcome to both of you. So, front pages, let's start, shall we, with The Guardian. It leads with growing calls for an investigation into how the self-confessed rapist David Carrick was allowed to be a Metropolitan Police officer. While the Daily Mail reports that despite his crimes, Carrick may still be allowed to keep his £22,000 annual police pension, something the Mayor of London wants to stop. The Metro has word of industrial action across multiple sectors on February the 1st, as rail staff, teachers, university lecturers and civil servants across a number of government departments all stop work. While the Daily Mirror claims that rather than pay nurses a fair wage, the government is offering £40 an hour to people willing to cross their picket lines. According to The Eye, the Business Secretary Grant Shapps has said he is opposed to forcibly installing energy prepayment meters in the homes of people who fail to keep up with their bills. The Express has word from the Prime Minister that his so-called bonfire of EU regulations will be a major boost to the UK's economic growth. The Telegraph leads with concerns expressed by the Equality Minister that a ban on trans conversion therapy must not be used to criminalise parents of trans children. The front of the Times carries a warning from the boss of the Food Standards Agency about the dangers of bringing cake into the office, apparently just as harmful as passive smoking, the paper reports. The Financial Times reports that the International Monetary Fund is upgrading its economic outlook amid signs that the global economy is starting to show signs of improvement. And because we like to bring you a mix of stories, The Star says a Republican congressman from Tennessee is insisting that Joe Biden has covered up hundreds of UFO sightings and that there's proof for his allegations in the Bible. Not to be outdone, The Sun says sports presenter Gary Lineker was drowned out by sound effects from a porn film during an on-set prank. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's head straight to our guests then, Kezia Dugdale and Henry Hill, who are with us. And Henry, let's start with the Metro, shall we? It's one out, all out. We've always wondered whether strike action would coalesce. And February the 1st, this paper suggests, is the day.
Yes, absolutely. So it looks like what's happening is across the public sector, multiple trades unions representing teachers, nurses, railway staff, civil servants and others are coordinating their strike action effectively so that it all takes place on the same day. Now, this might not be as bad for the government as you initially think. There was an interesting line, I think, in one of the papers about the nurses saying that actually, well, if the teachers had gone on strike on a different day, we'd probably have had to stay home anyway because of the childcare crisis that would have immediately created. But nonetheless, it is a sign that this problem isn't going away, and it will obviously make the strike action more visible. You know, if you're a parent who also has to get to work and all of a sudden not only is your kid's school shut, but your commuter train isn't running and all the rest of it, it will really drive home the scale of the industrial action currently facing the country and its impact on public services.
Yes, your thoughts on that, Kezia? Well, we weave in the Telegraph, which is about how head teachers will, plan around the teaching strike. The Telegraph suggesting that head teachers are refusing to put in place contingency measures that could limit the impact of staff walkouts. Question is whether they will, or their union will reballot again to see if they'll also take strike action. So, your thoughts?
Yes, it shouldn't surprise us that the trade unions are working collectively together to enhance the pressure on the UK government to settle a series of pay disputes that have been rumbling on for several months. It's a principle of the Labour movement that by the strength of your common endeavour, you can achieve more together than you can alone. And that's what we're going to see on the 1st of February. This story in the Telegraph, however, about the role of head teachers, I find really fascinating. So I don't think that the union representing head teachers are yet to say that they as an entity are about to go out and strike. But what they are talking about here is the degree to which they are prepared to be involved in strike-breaking activities, just how prepared they are to facilitate schools still functioning in the absence of teachers and classroom assistants and other support staff that help the schools run. It looks very much like they're going to be on the side of the teachers in supporting that industrial action rather than busying themselves and doing everything they can to try and make things continue as normal. I think that shows that there's a great deal of sympathy for the strike action. In fact, repeated public public polling shows that the public are on the majority side of backing the trade unions and pay deals for public sectors, and that can only bring further headaches for the UK government.
Yes, and certainly figures today, Henry, that showed public sector pay increases are indeed lagging behind the private sector. I know everyone brings in the pensions at this point, but notwithstanding that. So why isn't the government now moving heaven and earth, to meet these unions and try to resolve this? Because you can't keep going at this, can you?
No, they can't. And although you have flagged it, I think the easiest win for the government would be to make an offer that said, look, if we reduced your mandatory pension contributions, allow you to take more of that as cash, that is a relatively simple way that they could increase monthly take-home pay for a lot of these workers. The government is in a tricky position because this round of pay demands is really just a shadow of what's going to come next year, because the independent pay bodies that the government it has based its positions on, their information, their projections did not take into account the level of inflation that we've seen over the last few months. The next set of projections this year will, which means the government knows that this year it's going to have to settle another round of bump pay demands next year. Now, the big problem for the government, the structural problem, is that there is already not enough money. Taxes are as high as they've been in a very long time. Lots of public services are running on fumes, and the more money that gets sucked into pay effectively is less money that you can spend on capital investments and innovation and so on. But on the other side of the coin, and this is where I think the government's sort of really tough strike rhetoric doesn't really work, you do ultimately need people to be prepared to work in these industries, and they do need to be paid a decent wage. The slightly fatuous comparison with Margaret Thatcher, I think, is often drawn by some Conservative MPs. Margaret Thatcher was pushing towards, basically the end of an industry, right? There was a clear end point at which point the NUM would no longer be relevant. That's not the case here. Even if, in the best case scenario, if the government somehow broke the strike, we'd still need nurses, we'd still need train drivers, we'd still need teachers. All of these issues would remain. So I think the government's problem is it's trapped between not having a strategy and the public having a lot of support for the strikers, and the blunt fact that there is simply not enough money to keep supporting the current size of the British state.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? Now, the cost of the NHS is often raised at that point. The Royal College of Nursing, to pick one example, suggesting they'd meet the government halfway. Is 10% still too much for the government to afford, do you think, Kezia, because of the idea of baked-in wage inflation?
No, I don't think it's too much. And my rationale for that is simply to point you to what NHS boards, the length and breadth of the country, are paying in the form of agency staff wages at the point where they don't have nurses on their payroll or on their workforces, paying 3, 4, sometimes 6 times the average hourly wage that a nurse receives on bank holidays, for example, to fill the gaps. We are spending inordinate amounts of money trying to redress problems that come down to poor workforce planning, the inability to recruit enough nurses in the first place. And I'm sorry to be the first person to mention the word tonight, but Brexit has had a huge impact on our National Health Service and our ability to recruit the staff we need for it to run, which means the staff who are left there are underpaid, with a great deal of demands on their time and on their energies than they've ever faced before. And that's why they're at their wits' end. That's why nurses are striking for the first time in 100 years. That's how serious this is, and how persistent they are in their demands for a decent pay rise.
OK, we'll certainly keep an eye on what happens on Feb the 1st and indeed this week with more strikes due. But let's move on, shall we, Henry, to a story that has horrified many, including the Prime Minister, as we heard today. Appalled, he called it, The Guardian's leading on this as well, about the former, we can now say, Met Police officer David Carrick, and the questions about why he was allowed to stay in position so long, and should there be a proper inquiry into officers who allowed him to stay in the Met, Henry?
I mean, yes, there should. There are so many things that are absolutely horrifying about this story. The specifics of the man's crimes, obviously, first and foremost. But you read about it, and you read about how basically so many of these police officers are saying, "Oh yeah, we knew he was a wrong 'un. He had a reputation as a wrong 'un," and it's like, well, how did nothing happen? How are we in a position where an institution which relies on public trust, the police absolutely rely on public trust to do their job, allowed a man like this to stay in post? Because what he didn't just, by abusing his position as a police officer to attack women, he didn't just commit those individual crimes. That stained the uniform. You look at you look on the internet, and you look at the reaction to this story, and what you're seeing is women who are saying, "How am I ever going to trust the police?" And that's awful. That's a huge societal harm that this man and the actions of men like him have done. So absolutely, it's past time at this point that there was a proper root and branch clear out in the Met and any other affected force, and we need much more rigorous procedures in place to make sure that these officers are drummed out and properly punished, and that if they're not, people are held accountable for that failure.
Yes, in a 2-hour hearing today, to strip him of his job, even that wasn't straightforward, Kezia. Well, the Daily Mail says, what happens to his pension? That surely has to go too.
Yes, this is the astonishing reality that he may be entitled to keep his £22,000 final salary pension simply because the heinous crimes that he committed were committed off duty out with of uniform. I think everybody in the country will be pretty shocked to hear that and want some pretty urgent resolution to it. Let me just add, though, I agree with every single word that Henry has said there. And this man has become a very unfortunate poster boy for a much deeper problem in the Metropolitan Police. We're talking here about over 1,000 different officers being investigated for over 1,600 different types of offence in the realms of sexual offence or domestic violence. That's not just a problem, that's an endemic problem. And it does feel like we've been here before, that we've heard promises from senior police leaders that there'll be a root and branch review, that we'll learn lessons, that things will happen. So every time they do that, the public's willingness to believe that things will actually change, I think, depreciates, putting even more pressure on Mark Rowley, the Chief Police Superintendent, to do something really quite dramatic here. And what Harriet Harman's been calling for today is to say, well, look, it's not enough just to pursue the people who've committed offences. We should also be pursuing the people that knew about it and did nothing too. That bystander approach is a new angle in this very, very long-standing story.
Yes, absolutely. And the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, suggesting that she was braced for more shocking cases to emerge in the wake of the David Carrick scandal. Lots of the focus has been on how to improve things via vetting becoming more meaningful, Henry. But in the Telegraph article, the suggestion too that the Home Secretary would make it, or is considering making it easier for chief constables to sack corrupt or abusive officers.
Yeah, I think the second is especially important. Better vetting is always good, but fundamentally, there's only so much that vetting can do, because obviously, this man had not committed his offences, and given that he exploited his position as a police officer, had not had an opportunity to perpetrate his crimes before he became a police officer. So what you need is, yes, you need vetting, but you need to make sure that there are really robust and stringent mechanisms in place for identifying this, for encouraging other police officers to come forward, for having maybe a confidential way that they can do that, and then for making sure that all those complaints are properly followed up. Like we've all seen cop shows, and normally, the people from internal affairs, all the cops hate them, they hate other cops and so on. But fundamentally, it's really, really important that the public bodies we entrust with especially with policing, right, with exercising force. He was an armed officer. He's one of the very few people that this country allows to carry a gun. It's really important that those institutions are policed more rigorously. And actually, one thing I think the government should consider doing is actually introducing, and I don't really do this often because we have an awful lot of criminal offences, but I think that abuse of the uniform and conduct in a way that actually, as I said earlier, degrades the public's faith in institutions like the police should be either a new criminal offence, or it should be a really strong compounding factor in sentencing. So that, it's right, I think, to hold police officers to a higher standard. If they commit crimes, they should do more time than people who've done the same thing as civilians.
So we move on to gender recognition and conversion therapy. So Kezia, what exactly is conversion therapy, and what are the concerns being expressed in the Daily Telegraph's lead story?
So these are two separate stories rolled into one front page. One is about banning conversion therapy, and I'll explain that in a second. And the other is about the UK government's response to the passing of the Gender Recognition Reform Act in the Scottish Parliament. Conversion therapy, bluntly, is where you seek to try and cure people of their sexuality. That's what you would describe it if you were talking about gay conversion therapy, and there's also a version of it to try and dissuade people from changing their gender. Now, this has been an issue the Conservatives have grappled with for a number of years and changed their position on a number of times, largely driven by some views that Kemi Badenoch, amongst others, have had about it. So what she's doing, in some very interesting timing, aligning this announcement at the same time as the developing story in Scotland around gender recognition, is to say that yes, they will ban conversion therapy as it applies to both gay people and to trans people, but they will have some extra clarification around the banning of the trans conversion therapy to reassure religious groups and indeed parents that nothing that they would do to perhaps try and dissuade their children from changing their gender would lead to them being criminalised as parents for trying to do that particular thing for their child. That all comes down to the definition in the law of what conversion therapy actually is and looks like. But there's no doubt it's an appeasement to the kind of right and far right of the Conservative Party, who will see this as real dilution of what was originally intended in Conservative Party policy.
OK, and then we move on to the battle between Holyrood and Westminster over Scotland's gender recognition legislation. The story in the Metro, though, takes a slightly different tack, which is at what age is it appropriate for you to determine your own gender? Now, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, had expressed concerns about the age of 16, whereas we heard from Gillian Keegan, in fact, speaking on Sky News, saying that 16 was not too young for people to decide to change gender. Anyway, lots has come out of this, not least the battle which we're expecting with Holyrood, Henry.
Yeah, absolutely. Gillian Keegan has, I imagine, after some strict words from Downing Street, rode back on her comments to an extent. For me, I think the most interesting thing about them really is that all of the things that she listed that she could do at 16, most of them you can't do now, right? You know, she says we left school at 16. I think you now have to be in education till 18. The law is going to change very soon, I think, so that you can only get married at 18. So the UK really is in a muddle in general over the age of consent. The battle in Scotland is basically the UK government has for the first time, I think, ever invoked Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998, which basically allows the UK government to block legislation passed by the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, if it thinks that legislation negatively impacts important UK-wide policy. Now, the Equality Act 2010, which is basically
Henry,
the
you'll have to rush. You've only got 10 seconds left. Could you just draw it to a conclusion?
Basically,
I do
the Equality Act is a reserved piece of legislation. British government thinks it will undermine it and has blocked the legislation. Sturgeon's going to challenge it in court.